Okay, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce everyone to the Distinguished Lecture Series for the Tech Policy Lab, the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab. And it's a great pleasure to have General Chilton come out. Probably almost about a year ago, I reached out to General Chilton and asked if he was available. And it took a while to schedule this, but I'm very, very excited to have him out here. General Chilton has a very, very unique background. He spent 34 and a half years in the U.S. Air Force. The most recent position, he retired as Commander of U.S. Strategic Command. So you think about the Department of Defense, the part of the Department of Defense that is in charge of everything related to nuclear, space, and cyberspace. Prior to his appointment as Commander of U.S. Strategic Command, he was Commander of Air Force Space Command. And has a number of other experiences in the past as well. So he was involved, a wing commander for the U-2 spy plane. He was an F-15 fighter jet pilot. And you also the pilot of 2 space shuttle missions, and on total of three space shuttle missions. And so with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce General Chilton, who will be talking about deterrence in the 21st century, from nuclear to space to cyberspace. And also I've encouraged General Chilton after the lecture itself, I will have a bunch of Q&A. And for this, I encourage you to ask any questions you think might be relevant. So things that are related to the talk or General Chilton's background as an astronaut pilot and so on. As I would say that I've had the great pleasure of talking with General Chilton on numerous occasions, and every time I talk with him, I learn something different, something unique. For example, I remember you telling me about making the floor the ceiling, a question that you can ask about later, or you might also ask about his first flight on the Space Shuttle Endeavor's actually first voyage. So with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce General Chilton.
Thanks, man. That's the first time I've ever seen you use a microphone.
Oh, really?
Thanks, Yoshi. You know, I was just telling Yoshi, that's the first time I've ever seen him have to use a microphone to command a room. He's got this booming voice, and ever since I've known him, and it didn't matter the form. He was about 50 decibels higher than what we needed to be able to hear him and understand him, and he's a fabulous speaker, and instantly gains the attention of whatever crowd he's talking to. So Yoshi, thanks for the kind introduction. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be able to accept the invitation and be here with you today. On the other hand, I'm a bit intimidated because never have I been invited to be a distinguished speaker. Now, I've given a lot of talks, but it isn't. I think it's pretty intimidating when they bill you as distinguished. Extinguished I could deal with, but distinguished I'm not so sure. So I'm flattered to be asked, and it's great to be on the stage. Although I've been to Seattle before, this is my first trip to the University of Washington, and I arrived yesterday, and what a fabulous experience this has been. And I want to extend my personal thanks not only to Yoshi, but to Emily, who really helped just organize me getting here and all the logistics behind that, but also to all of the faculty and students I've had the opportunity to spend time with. They're so generous with their time with me, and I have just been so impressed with not only the things they are working on, but their passion and enthusiasm for it. You have a wonderful thing going here at the University of Washington, and I know in life you can get too close to some things, or so close to some things sometimes that you begin to take them for granted. Please don't do that while you're here. It's a beautiful thing, and so it's truly my pleasure to be here. I wanted to talk about deterrence, and Yoshi said, yeah, that's a good thing to talk about, and then I got here and I said, yeah, normally astronauts, there's an old saying in the Air Force, if you want to shut up a fighter pilot, which I used to be, you tie his hands behind his back, because they're always talking like this, right? So you tie their hands behind their back, they can't talk. And astronauts, the way you shut up an astronaut is you unplug their audio visual, because they're always showing a movie. And I got here and I thought, yeah, I got a great astronaut movie I could show, but instead I'm going to talk about what sounds like a relatively boring subject, deterrence. So why? Well, because I think deterrence is really important. And I think it was something that the United States of America, and certainly our principal adversary post-1945 until 1991, the Soviet Union, we took deterrence very, very seriously. Now, as a young, fighter pilot, I used to think my main job in life was to fight and win our nation's wars. But as I matured and thought about it more, I realized that the higher calling in the military, the higher calling, is to deter warfare, is to get the United States' way in the world without spilling anybody's blood. And that is a science. There's an art to that and a science to that. And it goes beyond brute force. It includes brute force in the threat, to be sure. But it's a sophisticated approach to dealing with issues on the world stage that I think is truly the highest calling of anybody who wears the cloth of their country in the service of their country in the military uniform. Better first to deter conflict than to ever put ourselves in a position where we have to spill American blood to preserve our freedoms or achieve and preserve our vital interests in the world. Now, before I dive into that deep subject, let me echo something that Yoshi said. So I have been blessed with a really cool career. Really weird. If when I was a lieutenant, if they said, okay, what do you want to do, Lieutenant, when you go through the Air Force? If I had written down what I actually ended up doing, they'd have looked at it and laughed and said, you can't do that, it's impossible. And so I was blessed with good fortune, great bosses, great people to work with, and timing and luck is so important in life to lead me through various paths from being a reconnaissance pilot in the F-4 to an air-to-air pilot in the F-15 to being a test pilot to being an astronaut to being involved in political military affairs in 9/11, to being in the Pentagon on 9/11, to find myself over in Islamabad and Afghanistan and Uzbekistan and places that I couldn't spell when I was a young man shortly thereafter, and then back in the space business at Space Command and ultimately doing cyber work, space and nuclear deterrence work in my last assignment. If you put that on your dream sheet, they'd laugh. And so I want to emphasize what Yoshi said. I'll take the Q&A area any way you want to go. It doesn't just have to be about the topic I'm going to speak about. And the other thing that is a ground rule is you may ask me any question you want. It can be technical, it can be personal, it can be opinion-based. It doesn't bother me. Don't be embarrassed to ask me a question. I know that's usually not a problem on college campuses, as the teachers here, the professors here will probably attest to. But please don't be afraid, and I promise you I will do my best to answer the question, and if I don't want to, I won't. Okay, so that's the ground rules. That's fair, I think, all right? So let's begin with the Merriam-Webster definition of deterrence. I always like to go to the dictionary first before I start talking about something. So the dictionary says deterrence is defined as the act of making someone decide not to do something. The act, so there's action involved in deterrence. Making someone decide, so there's a psychology associated with deterrence. You're really affecting the decision process of a decision maker, okay, in deterrence. Not to do something, not to cross a red line, we'll call it. Not to do something not in our interest or in the deterring party's interest. Or they say it's the act of preventing a particular act or behavior from happening. Now there's a guy who's done a lot of writing on deterrence that's with us today. He's a great scholar in this area. His name is Keith Payne. And Keith did us all the benefit of going back and doing the research and archival research on the studies that were done in the early 1960s by two gentlemen in two camps in the United States, Dr. Schelling and Dr. Kahn, who were the original writers on deterrence in an era where we had this new, awful, terribly powerful weapon called the atomic bomb. And how, after the Soviets developed it, stole it actually, after they got it anyway, how we were going to strike a balance in the world vis-a-vis that empire. And Schelling and Kahn were two different schools of thought on writing on it, and appropriately titled. Keith's book, and I commend it to you if you want to get into to understanding deterrence theory, which I think is a good thing to do, not only for the nuclear business, but as I'll talk a little bit about space and cyber. If you don't understand the basic fundamentals of deterrence, it's hard to apply them in these different domains. And his title of the book was called The Great American Gamble, which it truly was at the time, as to how we were going to use this new terrible and powerful weapon. And Keith says, deterrence is a strategy of issuing threats to cause another to decide against unwanted behavior. Okay? Issuing threats to affect a decision maker to not do something that you don't want them to do. Or he also goes on to say the will of the target. So if I'm trying to deter you from doing something, okay, the will of the target poses a challenge to the reliable and predictive functioning of deterrence. The target audience must have the will and capability to comply with my demand. If you don't, I can't deter you. You have no choice but to go against my will. You must have the understanding and fear of the threat which I'm putting on the table, that I've threatened to unleash against you should you cross my red line. And the audience must have the belief that the threat of use is real. It's credible. It can't be, so I used this at lunch the other day. We were talking. I said, if you threaten me, if you say I don't clean my plate off after this luncheon today and take it and throw it in the trash can in the appropriate recycle bin, you're going to shoot me. I'm not deterred by that because it's not a credible threat. Why would you? That's ridiculous, Plus, I don't think you got a gun. So, the threat has to be credible in the mind of the deterred for it to be an effective deterrent. So these are some fundamental theory spots. At the end of the day, the party doing the deterring must have two things. Must have a real capability, something that really scares the other individual or entity, and must have the will to use it. Doesn't do you any good to have this capability if you don't ever use it, or you present yourself as someone who might be a little weak-kneed in a conflict and might not use it. So capability and will are essential to deter another person. And it's best if you can demonstrate the capability, and it's best if you can demonstrate the will. So those are kind of essential for me if I want to deter you from doing something. And the party being deterred, first of all, it's got to be aware of the capability. If they're not, then they just go whistling through life, not understanding what's at risk, what sword is being held over their head. And they need to understand the red lines that they have to mind, if you will. And if they don't understand them very well, then they're not going to be deterred probably. In fact, they may miscalculate, which oftentimes has led to warfare in history. As I mentioned, they have to believe that the threat is credible, and they have to believe that if they do the attributable, or if they do the act that is being asked not to do, that they'll be attributed. In other words, if I tell you, don't do something, but you think there's no way you're going to know if it was me or that guy who did it or that guy who did it, then you may be tempted to miscalculate and do it anyway, thinking you could get away with it. So if they believe that they can be attributed, they're more likely to be deterred. And then they have to believe that if the deterrent is unleashed, the threat, that it will cause either unacceptable damage or loss to something that they truly value, or that it will deny them what they want to achieve by crossing that red line. So it's either going to hurt really bad if I do this, or if I do this, it won't matter. I'm not going to achieve my objective, so what's the point of doing it? And if you believe that, then you'll be deterred, we hope. This is the theory. There's one final part that many people often leave out besides the threat of punishment and the threat of not being able to achieve the desired outcome. It can be very, very important, and particularly in today's world where we have different table stakes than we had in the Cold War with various countries in this kind of multipolar environment. And that's the party being deterred must believe that restraint is the least worst option. Okay? So I'm going to do this thing and suffer the pain. That's bad. I'm going to do this thing and not achieve my objective. That's not good. I'm not going to do anything, but in not doing something, I'm likely to pay a price as well. And it has to be less painful than the first two choices. So restraint has to be the least worst option for the individual. And we'll talk about how that maybe can be changed. It seems so obvious, but perhaps in today's world it's more relevant, this notion of restraint, than it was in the Cold War in a bipolar world. So tonight I propose we take a look at the strategy of deterrence through these lenses of capability and will, awareness, credibility, attribution, unacceptable damage to something of value, denial of objective, and restraint. And let's begin with an example of deterrence strategy that, at least empirically, we can say has worked very, very well for the last 71 years. And that is the nuclear deterrence strategy of both the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So compliments to both. You can argue, whether you like nuclear weapons or not, that Since 1945, the world has changed because of them. There has been no great power war since then. There are many people who dream of a world without nuclear weapons, and in my idealistic moments and hopeful moments, I share that dream. On the other hand, it's important to remember that everyone in this room has at their fingertips the ability to do research and figure out what a world without nuclear weapons is actually like. Because that was the world of human history all the way up until August 1945. And if you look at what a world without nuclear weapons was like, and you looked at the trends in that world, the trends were not going in a good direction with regard to the loss of human life and the suffering of humanity on the planet. From World War I, from the trenches in the Somme to Verdun, to the terrible gas and vicious ways we determined through technology, machine guns, etc., we figured out better conventional ways to slaughter each other. To the beaches of Normandy, Iwo Jima, Tarawa, the fire bombings of Tokyo, of Dresden, of Berlin, the bombings of London. If you look at what we unleashed and continue to unleash as humanity, as a world, against one another before the advent of the nuclear deterrent, which suddenly made global warfare totally unimaginable, we were pretty awful. If you look at the estimates of deaths in World War II, both civilian and military, over a 6-year period from 1939 to 1945, the estimates, which can never be nailed down exactly, range from 60 to 80 million people killed in a 6-year period. That's a hard number to get your head around. I know this is a big data institute here. We do a lot of work with big data. 60 to 80 million people killed. If you just do a little back of the envelope math. Let's say 70 million, that's a middle number. Over 6 years, 365 days, it's 32,000 people were killed every day. Not wounded. You double the number if you want to count wounded. 32,000 every day for 6 years. In the nuclear world, that would be dropping a Hiroshima bomb every other day on a city on the planet for 6 years. And yet that all ended after August 1945. Not that there haven't been wars and conflicts, but nothing on that scale. And we were not headed in the right direction in those years. So I would posit that the deterrent has served its purpose, however unpalatable it is to our common senses and hatred for such a powerful and destructive weapon. So let's take a look at the US versus the Soviet Union and now Russia, because it's pretty much the same adversaries with slightly different, we think, ideology these days. And the underlying premise of the US strategy has remained essentially unchanged since we came up with the strategy in the late 50s, early 60s. And in fact, President Obama, in his nuclear posture review, which he signed out in 2010, and I expect the next president of the United States will conduct a nuclear posture review when they take office and sign it out sometime at the end of next year or the beginning of 2018. It's not a rite of passage, it's an important document. And President Obama's document said the fundamental role of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack on the United States, our allies, and our partners. Now, I know who our allies are because we have treaties signed with them. That's pretty straightforward. Who are our partners? It's a pretty specific declaratory statement here, which is part of how you demonstrate your will. You write it down, you give a speech, make sure the world reads it, understands your red line. Don't attack us with nuclear weapons. Don't attack our allies. It's pretty clear. But who the heck are the partners the United States is talking about? There's some ambiguity there, right? And oftentimes in a deterrence strategy, you want to be very specific, but not too specific. Not too specific. And even we in the United States are guilty of that, if that's what you want to call it, in our declaratory policy, which President Obama signed, which is not very different than every policy that's been promulgated or expounded on since Kennedy was the president of the United States. Secretary of Defense Gates went on in his preamble to this document to kind of expand on why we have this deterrent. He said in one sentence, he says, we have this to maintain strategic stability with other major nuclear powers. Now, what does that mean? And this is an important point, I think, that we take this term stability out of context here, particularly in people in this room like me who are engineers. You know, we think is it the inverted bowl that's unstable with the marble on top, or is it the bowl with the marble at the bottom? Or are we talking about a spring damper system that's going to, explode if we excite it at the resonant frequency? That is not strategic stability. Put simply, strategic stability is removing the temptation for your adversary to strike first. That's what we mean by stability here. That's what Secretary Gates is talking about. Removing the temptation for the other nuclear power who you want to deter from ever waking up on any morning of the year and calculating, today would be a good day to go. Or, I have no other choice but to go today for whatever reason. That's the notion of strategic stability. And it's really important when you start thinking about what kind of force structure you develop and how you posture that force structure. You want them to wake up every day and go, no, not today, every day. That's stability, okay? And so that's an important thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Gates went on to say we want to deter potential adversaries, that's clear. And then here's another interesting one that's always been part of our deterrence policy. Deter attack, he went on to say, we also want to reassure our allies and partners of our security commitments to them. Those commitments are left unstated. Now, with our allies, they're classically defense treaties. So if someone attacks one of our allies, NATO, Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, these are treaty allies, we will come to their defense, and vice versa. Partners, I'm not sure who they are again. I can tell you who I think they are. But we want to assure them that we will protect them, not just with conventional forces in this document. This is a nuclear document. We are extending the nuclear umbrella over them. If they are attacked with nuclear weapons, we're saying we will attack back on your behalf with our nuclear inventory. This is a pretty bold thing. The interesting thing about assurance, though, is that we don't get to decide who's assured and who's not. And that's a mistake you can often make. When President Obama came to office, he wanted to reduce the nuclear stockpile that we have. And we wanted to do it in negotiations with the Russians, and we did. And I had the good fortune to be a part of that, not the negotiations, but kind of the backplane support to that whole reduction. And it was a good thing, in my view. It wasn't a total win for the United States, and it wasn't a total win for them, so it was a good thing. But we reduced the inventory of weapons strategic weapons in both Russia and the United States. One set of weapons, though, that were not even on the table in the negotiations, the U.S. decided to reduce unilaterally for one pretty simple reason. The president said we're going to decrease our emphasis on nuclear weapons, so it lined up with that policy. But the bottom line was these weapons hadn't been well maintained. They'd been taken off. They were submarine-launched cruise missiles. They'd been taken out of the boats. They'd been in storage for years in bunkers at Navy bases, but they still counted against our total inventory. And he said, we're going to get rid of those. And the Navy said, good, because we don't want to fix them. And we thought, no big deal. The Japanese went ballistic. They said, that's the assurance weapon that we're counting on. I mean, they really believed that we would never launch an intercontinental ballistic missile to defend Tokyo. We'd never launch an intercontinental submarine-launched ballistic missile. But we would launch a cruise missile out of a submarine. That was believable to them. They thought that was credible. And that was their assurance. And why do we want to assure Japan that we would come to them with our nuclear deterrent? Because we don't want them to develop their own. It's part of our counter-proliferation strategy. We do not think the world would be a safer place if Japan had a nuclear deterrent, because you can bet South Korea would then field a nuclear deterrent. Taiwan might be interested. That would be a bad day. I mean, the opportunity for proliferation of nuclear weapons is broad. So that's why this assurance piece of our declaratory policy is so vitally important to a policy of the United States, which is we believe it's in our best interest that we kind of keep the nuclear club at its current size. Now, we failed in that regard in certain areas, but not because of the assurance aspect of our strategy. To date, that's held place, and we have since, after much dialogue, reassured the Japanese that our B-52s and B-2s are more than adequate to provide the kind of assurance that they would like, and they have agreed with that to date. But as you start talking about reductions, you have to remember that there can be knock-on effects there when you start reducing your posture with regard to nuclear capability. So, the capability question, of the deterring party was not in question in the Cold War. Clearly, the United States had the bomb and developed bigger and more powerful bombs, and so did the Soviet Union. And in fact, it was a demonstrated capability. The United States did 1,054 nuclear weapons tests. We detonated weapons during the Cold War. Of those 1,054, 219 were above ground, atmospheric. A few of those were underwater, and a few of those were actually in space. We detonated weapons in space. Not all of those were for the technical development of the inventory. Some of them were purely political statements, a reminder to the Soviets that we had the capability, and it was truly a destructive capability, and which again is essential to the deterring party to have that capability and demonstrate it. With regard to the will, that's a little bit harder to measure. Rhetoric matters in this regard. So if you Google some of Khrushchev's speeches, I think it was at the UN, or maybe in New York, we gave a speech, he took his shoe off, he pounded the table and said, we will bury you. We took that seriously as a declaratory statement and as a expression of the will of that leadership to actually use the nuclear deterrent should we cross their red line. Kim Jong-un, the dictator in North Korea today, he just loves to talk about the sea of fire that he is going to create in Seattle or San Francisco or Los Angeles or any West Coast city that he deems he would like to threaten us with. And again, it's rhetoric, but it's a demonstration of willingness, which he sees as a way to help deter the United States behavior that he wants to deter on the Korean Peninsula. As far as the United States, we had history on our side with regard to will. I mean, think about it. We not only dropped one nuclear weapon to end World War II, we waited a few days and dropped a second one. And this was to bring to close a conventional fight, not a nuclear fight. So our history would tell you that we have the demonstrated will to use the weapons, and this actually works to the benefit, years later, of the credibility of the deterrent. Now, turning to the deterred party, they, again, have to be aware of the threat, which is why it's nice to demonstrate the capability. It doesn't do you much good to keep it under a bushel basket, and they need to also understand your red lines. What is your declaratory policy? What is it you don't want me to do? And let's try to be as clear as possible about that. Where you're ambiguous, you can lead to miscalculation. Who is a partner of the United States? Well, we get to decide, not them. That works a bit to our favor, but it can be quite dangerous also. The movie Dr. Strangelove, anybody seen it? Stanley Kubrick. What a brilliant satire. I love that movie. Remember when I commanded 8th Air Force, I had all the B-52 guys and the B-2 guys work for me. I remember going down to the squadron one day in the ready room, and they're all sitting there watching that movie. And this is in 2005, and Kubrick made this movie in the 60s. It's timeless. And yet he did his homework. If you watch that movie through the lens of deterrence theory, he did his homework. He got it right. I mean, it's great satire and great humor and very dark black humor. But it's an excellent movie, and I'll never forget the scene where it's at the end of the movie. And the Russian ambassador is in the war room where you're not allowed to fight. That's another great line in the movie. You can't fight in here, this is the war room. And the Russian ambassador speaking, he's just told the President of the United States, if these guys get through and that nuclear weapon goes off over Russia, it will activate the doomsday machine. I said, what's that? They said, well, it's this automated system we've invented, and if a nuclear bomb goes off in Russia, without any human intervention at all, nuclear bombs will go off all over the world. We've planted them everywhere, and they're just going to go off by themselves. And Peter Sellers, who's playing Dr. Strangelove, looks at him and says, of course you know, the whole point of a doomsday machine is lost if you keep it a secret. It's true. And when the Russian ambassador answers, well, you know, the premier, he likes surprises. He was going to tell you next week. Too late. End of the world. You know, you can't keep the threat under a bushel basket if you expect to deter somebody. They have to be made aware of it. And they have to fear it. They have to fear it. Fear that it holds something at value, at risk. The belief in the credibility, that's a little bit more difficult to determine. Between the U.S. and the Russians, both sides accepted the opposite's credibility for at least a couple of reasons. One was they had similar table stakes. Both of us held an existential threat over each other, and it's true still today. We hold an existential threat over the country of Russia, and the country of Russia is one of two countries on the planet that holds an existential threat over us, Russia and China. And that's an important thing to admit and recognize. No matter what our relationships are, and they're going to wax and wane, they still have that capability, and it is existential. And I would argue it's the only existential threat to this country, are those two countries and their nuclear inventories and deterrence. We can debate that later if you'd like. So we have similar table stakes. We have similar, in the Cold War, we had similar arsenals. So there wasn't one group with a bunch of really big bombs and another group with a bunch of little bombs. We all had about the same kind of level of destructive capability and flexibility in choosing what weapons might be used in what scenarios. You know, where credibility really comes into question, and I've already hit on this already, is in the assurance area. So, and again, we don't get to decide who's assured and who's not assured. I can give you an example where assurance absolutely failed. And it was really before we developed the strategy very well. But France was part of NATO. They're the only part of NATO that developed their own nuclear deterrent. Why? De Gaulle didn't ever believe that we would trade Washington for Paris. He didn't trust us. He didn't trust that we would extend the deterrent to protect Paris, or his country. Because he didn't trust us, he was not assured. As a result, he developed his own nuclear deterrent. I would say in the balance, we worry about the same thing about Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia. Should Iran go nuclear? My biggest fear if Iran went nuclear personally was not the threat they posed to the United States of America. I thought we could both deter that and perhaps defend against it with a limited missile defense. My biggest concern is if Iran went nuclear, Saudi Arabia would go nuclear the next week. If nothing else, they can afford to buy a bomb, okay? But they would go nuclear. And if Saudi Arabia went nuclear, who else do you suppose might consider it? Turkey? Egypt? I mean, the cascading effect here of this loss of assurance and the credibility of the U.S. deterrent is really, really important as we look at the potential futures for the world. Attribution, this is really key for deterrence. You know, if someone thinks they can sneak one by you, they just might. They just might try. And this wasn't a problem in the Cold War. Once we developed things like satellites that could sit on orbit at geosynchronous altitude with infrared sensors and observe the entire world and report to the United States of America in near real time when any rocket left the surface. There's no doubt where it came from. We could see it. Maybe a little guessing going on when it came out of the ocean off a submarine, but if it wasn't one of ours, we knew who it belonged to, right? So attribution was never a real problem. We had radars in place to back it up, and we wouldn't make decisions until we had two phenomenology, both IR and radar. So attribution was pretty easy in the nuclear and remains that way today. Short of someone sneaking a nuclear weapon into New York Harbor on a boat. Not likely the Russians would do that. Would a third-party terrorist organization be tempted to do that if they could? Is it an existential threat to the United States? No. Would we figure out through forensics where it came from? Yes. How they got it might be a little harder problem. But you know, attribution is an important thing, and it was pretty well understood that both sides would be able to attribute an attack during the Cold War. If, however, they thought attribution, if they thought they could do this without being attributed, what you find yourself is in an unstable world. There is a temptation to strike first if you think you can do it without attribution. So attribution is very important in the whole theory of deterrence. Fear of unacceptable damage or fear of the loss of something you value. So in the Cold War, this was a bit of a problem that was debated among the Schelling and Kahn groups about, can we really know with the Russians or the Soviets at the time, can we really know what they fear, what they value? We know ourselves, we know what we fear. I mean, I think the United States, not uniquely, but pretty uniquely in the world, fears or, appreciates human life. And we fear the loss of innocent human life. It's really valuable to us. We don't like that. Soldier goes to war, he gets killed. We hate it, but we understand that. An innocent person in a city in America just going to school one day is struck down by an automobile. It bothers the heck out of us. We really do value life in a special way in this country. And the Russians knew that. The Chinese actually know that better than most. If you look at the Chinese deterrent as it's been in place for the last 20 years, not a very large inventory, not a very accurate inventory when you look at the accuracy of their intercontinental ballistic missiles. Probably circular or probabilities, 50-50 chance it's going to land within a 3-mile circle. It's not very, you would never use it to attack a military installation. But a city with a 4-megaton warhead on top of it, counter value, the United States fears that. So the Chinese only need about 20 of those to deter us in their mind because they understand our fears. In the Cold War, this was a matter of great debate vis-a-vis the Russians. Do they value their populace? Do the Soviet dictators, do they and the Communist Party value their populace the same way do? If not, what else do they value? They value their lives, probably, their power. They value their strategic forces, their nuclear forces. That's what gives them power in the world. I was shocked when I went to Russia for the first time in the early 1990s to find out we had been in a Cold War against a third world country with a lot of nukes. It's what gave them their great power status. So clearly they valued that. Their fielded conventional forces in Eastern Europe, which vastly outnumbered NATO and ours, they valued those. It's how they controlled the populations in Eastern Europe in the Warsaw Pact. So these were likely targets for us to target in the Cold War, to hold them at risk, and we believed, as best we could, that they valued those. And then on to the denial of benefit. This is an area where I'll talk a little bit about what some might consider cross-domain deterrence. I don't. It's in the same genre of military deterrence on a battlefield. But what happened after 1945 is the U.S. Army came home from Europe, with the exception of the occupying forces, which stayed through about 1950, 51, 52, and then we started to draw those down. We left some bases over there, not insignificant. But if you looked at the Soviets, they did not go home. They stayed in East Germany, they stayed in Poland, they stayed in Czechoslovakia, because they needed to stay to control the population, but they kept their military forces there. And we got to a point in the 1960s where we looked across and said, there's nothing to stop them from going all the way to the Atlantic coast if they want to. Certainly our conventional forces couldn't do it. So what did we do? We hung tactical nuclear weapons on every fighter squadron in Europe could carry tactical nuclear weapons. We developed nuclear artillery rounds for the Army, if you can believe it. Nuclear landmines, nuclear backpacks. We put tactical nuclear weapons all over Europe, in Western Europe, with our forces. And the notion was, we're not putting at risk the Soviet Union existentially, but we're putting at risk all their conventional forces. If they cross the line and come over and fight us, and they clearly could defeat our conventional forces in place, they would not achieve the benefit they wanted to achieve, which would be the conquest of Western Europe, because our nuclear weapons would deny them that sought benefit. So it was a part of our deterrence strategy. It's not a punishment part. It was a denial of benefit part. And it worked. In the 1980s, when we built up our conventional might under the Reagan buildup, we started taking those weapons out of Europe because suddenly the balance of conventional power allowed us to do that. Today, what are the Russians doing? They're building a lot of tactical nuclear weapons. They have changed their declaratory policy, where they used to say we would never use weapons first. They now say there are circumstances where we would use tactical nuclear weapons in a conventional conflict to protect Russian lives and property. That's a dramatic change in a red line and puts a lot of uncertainty in the mind of NATO and the US when they consider the possibility of a conventional conflict on the European continent. It might give you pause in how you react to a Russian invasion of Crimea, or a Russian invasion of Georgia, or a Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine. At what point do they determine that if they were to get in a conventional fight over that with us when they're starting to lose, at what point do they determine that the threshold has been crossed? Will we know that? It's uncertain. It's part of their deterrence strategy. And they've reversed the tables from the 1960s and 70s and are actually thinking that way now today, vis-a-vis us. Finally, restraint. So where's an example of restraint exercised in the Cold War? I would argue the Cuban Missile Crisis was one. So here we were at the brink. And if you've seen, if you've read and studied this and seen the movies, et cetera, whether they're dramatized or not, it was a dramatic time period. I mean, I remember as a kid, I was growing up in Los Angeles, and this was on the news. And I remember they had circles that showed the range of the missiles in Cuba. And they didn't reach Los Angeles. So I thought, perfect, we're good. Yeah, I don't need to worry about this. And this is the logic of a grade school kid, But they sure as hell reached Washington, D.C. and New York City and Boston and many other, and certainly Florida and many other industrial areas. It was a real deal. And the missiles were there. We did not know if the nuclear weapons were there or not, but we suspected they were. So, restraint. There was members of the U.S. military and politicians who thought the right answer was an immediate attack on Cuba, all out. Yeah, they might get one or two off, and they might have nukes in them, but we have to eliminate this threat. And the Soviets, on the other hand, had the option to launch, to follow through on it. And neither side did, thank God. Both sides showed restraint. Both sides calculated that restraint in this situation was the least worst option. And reflecting on it, I think they made a good calculation. I think that was the right choice. So, I used the Cold War scenario just as kind of a foil to set up the rest of the talk, which will be pretty short here because frankly, I don't know the answers to some of the questions. I'm going to leave those to the students, as any good lecturer would do on some of the things we're going to talk about here as we go forward. But, the deterrence balance between the U.S. and Russia today, as it was in the Cold War, it remains in a stable posture, I believe. Neither side is tempted to go first. But when we look at the multipolar nuclear world that we have today, it poses some interesting challenges for the United States vis-a-vis other potential adversaries. After 70 years, we feel comfortable believing we know what the Russians fear, but are we certain about what China fears, the other country that holds an existential threat? We need to know what they fear if we want to deter them. And we shouldn't assume that they immediately deter the same things we do, or fear the same things we fear in the West. That's a bad initial assumption. How about North Korea, who's developing nuclear weapons and means to deliver them? What do they fear? And what difference do the huge difference in table stakes make when you consider what's on the table for Kim Jong-un and North Korea versus us? He does not hold an existential threat against us, even if I'll assume he has 10 nuclear weapons and 10 missiles that can range the United States. Bad day. But not existential, probably. On the other hand, with our inventory, we could, destroy North Korea, clearly. So there's different stakes here. Kim Jong-un, he's got a television, and he's been paying attention to history lately. He may have a different threshold for first use, even though it would seem suicidal to us. He watched what happened to Saddam Hussein. He watched what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. He can expect, and likely expects, that if he ever lost a conventional fight on the Korean Peninsula, that he would get the same fate. So if you believe that, you may do something desperate. And that desperate thing may be to utilize a nuclear weapon. Maybe not to launch at the United States, maybe launch it at Japan. Japan is key to the defense of South Korea. We need to flow forces through Japan. We need to resupply through Japan. Nuke Japan. Or be even less provocative. Do a high-altitude EMP over Tokyo that shuts down everything electronic in the city, and no one dies immediately. And there'll be pressure on the United States from the rest of the world not to retaliate with something that kills people. Maybe that's a strategy that he might use, a threshold he might cross, gambling that this is his chance to stop the war, and gambling that the US won't cross the nuclear threshold in retaliation. It's a different calculus, and it's a different challenge and a different problem that we have today than in the good old days, which I don't believe they were, of the Cold War. Will he choose restraint? I don't know. We don't know. And in fact, we've decided to hedge against that possibility, that he doesn't. And that's the reason we developed missile defense. It's the only reason well, it's two reasons. In case he was not restrained and thought foolishly to launch a system like this. And also, we never wanted a future president to be blackmailed, frankly, into not supporting the treaty alliance we have with South Korea. Without missile defense, the dictator in North Korea could say, if you attack me conventionally, I'm going to nuke Seattle. And now the United States can look back and put at least some uncertainty in the mind of that declaratory policy. Say, you may try, but we will shoot down that first attempt, and what comes at you right after that is going to be something that you're not going to be able to tolerate. And so that's the purpose for missile defense. In case he is not restrained, and so he doesn't blackmail us in the future. Now, we've explored the nuclear deterrent here, and we can talk more in the Q&A about that, and I think it's a particularly topical time to talk about it, since right now the United States is about to enter a great political debate about whether or not we should reinvest and sustain the deterrent as it is currently postured in the triad form that has worked, frankly, really, really well for the last 70 years. There's going to be a lot of posturing, a lot of articles in the newspaper, and hopefully this discussion of deterrence will help inform your background knowledge as you read those articles and form an opinion on whether or not we should recapitalize the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force, the submarine force, and the bomber force that we have today in place that assures the deterrent is effective against Russia and China. But now I'd like to kind of shift to the question of whether or not a deterrence strategy might work in the domains of space and cyberspace. Can these fundamental principles be applied and shifted over, and what are some of the challenges there, if not? And strictly for to pick a foil to work this against, I'm going to pick China. And there's a reason I'll pick China. So we're not at war with China today. They're not a declared adversary, but I'm going to be hypothetical. And this is what military peoples do. They look forward into the future and say, what's the worst thing that could happen? And they start planning and thinking about it. So it's in our DNA. You may not like that I picked China, but there's reason for it. Okay, and I'll try to explain those. What is China starting to do today in the South China Sea? Trying to expand their influence into an area that, oh, by the way, into territories that are mutually claimed by one of our treaty allies, the Philippines, and some of our partners in the region, you might argue, Malaysia, Indonesia. And it's a dangerous game the Chinese are playing. They're not just claiming the islands, they're claiming the 200 nautical mile economic exclusion zones off those islands, and so de facto they're claiming the whole South China Sea belongs to them. And they're claiming it on a historical basis. I tell people, be careful digging in your backyard if you find a piece of broken Chinese crockery. They may be knocking on your door saying, oh, by the way, didn't you know that we discovered your property and historically it's ours? I mean, it's that kind of rationale they're saying is why the South China Sea islands, which don't really exist, they've built, exist today. China in 1998, when I came back from NASA to the Air Force, was already writing about US power and what they were going to have to do to counter it. And they've been very transparent about it. And one thing I like about the Chinese, they write about this stuff and then they do it. And then we wake up 10 years later and go, I can't believe they did that. But they actually follow through on these things. And in 1998, I remember coming back from NASA and reading some Chinese writings, translated, of course, and it said, the US power is demonstrated in the Gulf War and then in Bosnia and Kosovo. Clearly, they have an asymmetric advantage over us because of two things. Their space capabilities, which allows them to operate over the horizon with precision weapons, and their ability to command and control forces at long range, not beyond line of sight, to execute a plan. They're spectacular at that. And so China, we have to develop capabilities that will counter those. And they said that in 1998. And what have they done? Well, in 2007, they launched a successful direct ascent ASAT and killed one of their own satellites to prove to us that they can kill that satellite capability should they choose to. Not only that, they continued on to field it. 2014, they launched another rocket that flew up toward geosynchronous orbit, and we assessed it was an anti-satellite capability. And they didn't hit anything, but we believe they have the capability to do it. They didn't want to hit it because probably we put so much pressure on them diplomatically and internationally after they created all that debris in their first test. But I think they have demonstrated the capability and are fielding an anti-satellite capability. And it's not in the interest of the United States for them to ever shoot that thing. It's probably, in my view, it's not in the interest of the world for them to create more debris in low Earth orbit. Their aspirations are to control the resources in the South China Sea. They want to figure out a way to do that without getting into conflict with the United States of America. So they have a deterrence strategy too, you have to believe. And that strategy is to deter U.S. intervention in that part of the world. Don't come over here, this is our neighborhood. It's a bit of the Monroe Doctrine for them in that area, stay away. And if you don't, some bad things might happen, like we might shoot down your satellites. They don't say that. But I mean, their actions would suggest that in a dust-up with the United States in the South China Sea, or off the Senkakus for that matter, in the disputed islands between China and Japan, another treaty ally, they certainly hold that threat. And if I was them, I would want that threat too, because it's tough to take on the United States when they have that satellite capability. But you take away GPS, you blind us from our ability to use our reconnaissance satellites, you take away our over-the-horizon communication, the United States Navy and the United States Air Force have a real hard time fighting beyond line of sight of the continental United States, effectively. And we certainly did it in World War II, but a great loss. We're not used to those kind of losses anymore, folks. We're used to these very surgical wars where we win, they lose, not many people die. That's not the fight that would happen if we lost our space assets and decided to go protect our treaty allies, the Philippines or the Japanese, in this kind of fight. It would be a tough and bloody fight for the United States of America. China knows we value these assets. They know they're key to our warfighting capability. They also know they're key to our economy. The GPS constellation isn't just cool because Waze tells you how to get someplace. It's also provides a timing signal that's fundamentally important to Wall Street, to banking, to the exchange of money, to getting gas out of the filling pump at the gas station. To use the timing signal from GPS. To make that all work when you put your credit card in and all that thing is synced up, those computers are dependent on it. It can impact the economy of the United States by putting those assets at risk, not just our warfighting capability. So it sounds like a pretty good deterrent to me. Make us think twice about either getting involved or making them too angry in that area. But that's not in our interests. Our interests are in protecting our allies and protecting our key equities and our vital interests in the South China Sea, which is one of the greatest shipping lanes for ships coming out of the Straits of Malacca, where tremendous amounts of the economy of the world travel through. And we think it's pretty important that they stay free and open to other countries' use, and let alone the disputed issues over who gets the rights to the oil or petrochemicals that may or may not be under the reefs that are in the center of that great sea. They have the capability. We're aware of that. We assess it's credible. And we can attribute it. We know if they did it, that they would have done it. And I doubt personally that we would be deterred if they did it. I don't think we would consider it an unacceptable cost. Nobody dies when you shoot space assets. I don't think it would deny the U.S.'s objective of ending a conflict in support of a treaty ally. I think we would be greatly tempted to go in there anyway. And problematic that the U.S. would show any restraint, particularly if we were engaged in the defense of that ally. So we're kind of in a bad position here, I would suggest. We may be deterred, or if we're not, and they execute the threat, we're in a bad position to go to war. Now, the myth, I call it a myth, but the theory in the past was we never want to field offensive space capability in the United States because we'd be inviting other people to do the same thing. And we have so much more to lose because we're so much more capable in space than they are. So we don't want to start that ball rolling down the hill. Well, I call it a myth because the Chinese are really capable in space today. They have more reconnaissance assets up in space than we have. They rely on over-the-horizon communication. They have their own GPS system. It's called Beidou. It's integrated into their national defense. I would argue that they are almost as dependent as us, as we are, when it comes to fighting over the horizon off the mainland of China. And so the question is, how do we deter them from attacking our space assets? Should we rattle the nuclear saber? Is that credible? Nobody dies in a space attack and we're going to launch a nuclear weapon against Chinese people? Innocents, some of them, whether we mean to or not, may not be a credible deterrent. I don't think it is. Conventionally, if you do that, we're coming after you. Well, maybe you can't come after them after they do that because they've eliminated your conventional power projection by coming after space. U.S. policy has been to take a defensive posture in space, and if we do anything offensive, to only field capability that is defined as reversible. Think a jammer that you can turn on and turn off, but not destroy. It may be time for us to rethink that policy. If nothing else, I would argue it would be better to go into a conflict in the scenario I described with a total level playing field, where neither side had space or both sides have space. That's best for the United States. And the only way to assure that you can level the playing field on a bad day is to develop offensive capability. And I think that can be part of a deterrence strategy. That can be woven into a strategy that deters China from crossing the threshold of holding your satellites at risk. Because you're going to go back at them and then you're going to come with conventional forces. And it's not going to be pretty, but I think the outcome is certainly more certain in that scenario, and I think the Chinese would appreciate it and could possibly be deterred. Other things people have talked about is strengthening the defense of our satellites. I think that's like strengthening the defense of a balsa wood tank on the battlefield. I mean, these things are so fragile, and so vulnerable that you could spend the nation's fortune on that, and you're never going to be sure that they're going to survive an attack from a direct ascent ASAT. Plus, we only replenish these things about every 15 years, and we just finished doing it. So we're not going to change anything that's up there anytime soon. Others say we might be able to deter China by starting to rely more on allies' capability in space. And then China would have to not only attack U.S. space assets, but they would have to also attack all our allies, and they don't want to go to war with the rest of the world. But maybe they are willing to do that when something they value is at risk. And what I believe the Chinese really value, given their history, is the existence of the dynasty. And in my view, the Communist Party is the current dynasty within the country of China. And they don't want it ever to go away. And the biggest threat to the dynasties in past history of China has never been from an external invader. It's also always been from internal revolt. And in China today, well, when I was a boy, Mao used to run around with his red book. And everybody dressed like Mao and rallied around the red book. You're hard-pressed to find a red book in China if you go over there as a tourist today. But what you will find are a bunch of people who are very nationalistic and proud of their country. And that can be a dangerous thing. That can be a dangerous thing if there's risk of loss of face or war and loss of confidence in the government. Because the backlash would not be external. It could likely be internal. And that's valued by the dynasty to make sure that doesn't happen. We certainly saw that in Tiananmen Square. I'm not sure any of this would work, but I kind of favor the level of playing field sense. I think you can deter better with offense than defense, and relying on the adversary to restrain themselves based on alliances in this particular scenario, I don't personally believe in. But we can debate that. Now let's shift to cyberspace, and this is the one where I'm going to have a lot more questions than thoughts on answers. And this is what's been so fun about being here the last 2 days, is to listen to you all and the work you're doing in cyber and your thoughts on it. So I'm really excited about the dialogue we have after this, which will shortly be over. The issues with developing a cyber deterrence strategy. Today, all sides seem to be pretty loath about showing their capability, offensive capability. Remember, if you don't show the offensive capability, you don't know what to be afraid of. You may make the adversary 10 foot tall in your mind, but they may not be. On the other hand, they may be 20 feet tall. It can lead to miscalculation. But we're not seeing anybody really demonstrating overtly and where they admit to it offensive cyber capability. We know it's happened. We suspect, I'm pretty sure the Russians did this in Estonia a few years back. In fact, I I visited with the Estonian Minister of Defense when I was in command, and he told me what happened and how they dealt with it, and I thought it was pretty fascinating. Probably the first case of a true cyber attack as opposed to cyber espionage, which is not an attack. We got to watch our lexicon there. It's spying, and spying's okay. Okay, we've been doing it forever. We don't go to war over spying incidents. Never have. We do go to war over attacks. We need to be careful about how we use that lexicon in this domain. Therefore, it's not really clear if the other side is aware of what can be done and what can't be done, and that puts the credibility of the threat in question. Attribution, I think, is one of the biggest ones. And for years, folks have said you just can't do it, so don't even think about deterrence in this domain. And then you'll have other people go, we're getting pretty good at this attribution thing. So I don't throw it out yet as an option. But I think it's essential. You got to have some confidence level in your ability to attribute a cyber attack if you're going to be declaratory in what you might do should you be attacked by cyber. Because you got to make the target know that you can look at them in the eye and say, I know you did it. So, and I'll know if you ever do it. So don't even think about trying. So, and then finally, what's a viable approach to encouraging restraint in the cyber domain? That is, not attacking through cyber in the calculus would be determined to be your least best, or to be your best option, not attacking. So this is a tough one also to think your way through. I would argue that today we're in an unstable environment where there is no disincentive to go first in the cyber domain. One, the attribution thing helps you out. You can say, he did it, not me. And you may think, I'm not sure. Who do I shoot back at? This is not a good place to be. We like strategic stability when it comes to deterrence. We don't want to tempt people into going first. And the attribution problem actually leads to that. If that's the case, how do you change that calculus? What do we do differently to change that calculus? Can we? Can we change that temptation to go first in this domain? And going first is likely not just to happen out of the blue. It's going to be a precursor, likely, to conflict. It's going to be part of an escalation. How do you get them to back off and de-escalate and stop and rethink and say, no, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think it's going to work. Like space, is leveling the playing field a viable strategy? I don't know. Yes or no? I'm not really sure on that. What about cross-domain deterrence? If you attack our critical infrastructure in cyber and the lights go out in New York City, we're nuking Beijing. Is it credible? I don't know. I can remember reading an article in the early 1990s that just stunned me. And the Russians, in this article, I don't know if it was true or not, but I read it in the newspaper, so it must be. The Russians came out and said, if there's any attack on our computer systems, we will consider that a nuclear attack and respond appropriately. I read this and I said, holy smokes, that is a huge change in declaratory policy. And about a week later, I saw another article come out, and it was basically the Rosanna Dana article that said, never mind. We didn't really mean that. Because I think they thought a little better about that at the time. This is the early 90s, when the dependency on cyber was not nearly what it is today for our nations. Their nuclear command and control, though, depended upon it, and I think that's what they were pointing out. But can you deter cross-domain? Can you hold something else at risk that's not using a cyber weapon that would make someone that, if you could attribute, they could do it? And what about the missile defense approach? Can you deny the objective sought? Is there some really good defensive things that we can develop that gives us the confidence to look them in the eye and say, bring it, we're ready, and you're going to lose. And will they believe it? These are really tough questions, and I'm going to leave and end this lecture, this distinguished lecture, I'm going to extinguish this lecture with those thoughts and those questions, because I do not know the answers, but I think they're very important questions for us to think about, and I think the best people to think about these questions are sitting in this room, some of the best people in America to think about these problems. How do we apply deterrence strategy and theory to the space domains and the cyberspace domains? Because again, I believe that's our highest calling, is to deter, not to fight. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks.
There are microphones up here if you want to
Thanks. And again, you can ask me about anything you want to ask. So we can talk about space, flying in space. I didn't bring a movie, so I'll try to talk without audio-visual. But, sir.
Okay, two questions for you. First, thank you for a very interesting talk, which was clearly worthy of being distinguished.
Well, thank you.
Question one is concerning first use. You touched on this with the Russian doctrine, but in general, does a doctrine of rejecting first use tend to undermine deterrence or enhance deterrence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Chinese are always beating on us because for years, they had a no first use declaratory policy. And they say, United States, you need to declare no first use. The rest of the world keeps saying that to us, and we refuse to do that. And I think we do that because it does increase the deterrent value. There's a little bit of level of uncertainty, particularly against, in the notion of the extended deterrent in our protection of certain allies. So, I mean, clearly the Chinese and the Russians know if they shot a nuclear weapon at the continental United States, we would respond. But we want them to think that if they were to, the North Koreans were to invade South Korea and the fate of South Korea was in the balance, and the only way we could stop the invasion was with a nuclear weapon, we might just do that.
The calculations would be the same in cyber as with nuclear?
That's a great question. I don't know if the calculations would be the same there. And we've never made, and nor has anybody that I know of. Of course, the Chinese deny they do anything wrong in cyberspace. They haven't stolen a thing. They're innocent. It's somebody else that's doing it in our name. So no one has really made a declaratory statement in cyber, and I haven't thought about that much. So it's a great question. But
my second question is, where do you come down on whether we need all three legs of the nuclear triad?
Yeah.
Could we save a few trillion shekels by phasing out the land-based or something?
Yeah, what's the shekel exchange rate these days?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. No, I'm a very, very ardent supporter of the triad. And I'll tell you why. Because the three legs of the triad, each has their own strengths and each has their own weakness. But together, they're pretty impregnable. So, we're going off to build the submarine right now, right? The money is being spent, the designs are in place, and most people think that's good enough. Submarines at sea, that's good enough. So why do we need these ICBMs? Well, first, why do we have the submarines? Because today they're pretty stealthy. They're very stealthy. And they're part of the assured response. Okay, if you wipe us out, we're going to pick somebody to be president, and they're going to have the ability to communicate with those guys, and they're going to get you. That's the assured response. But that assumes something, and that assumes no breakthroughs in anti-submarine technology for the next 60 years. It's a big assumption. Maybe not unreasonable, but it is a big assumption. Why do we need 400 ICBMs scattered around the country? Turns out they're the most stabilizing part of the triad. So imagine a U.S. nuclear deterrent that had none. We're not going to recapitalize them. We'll fill in all the holes with gravel. If that were the case, and given the current START limitations, which allow the United States of America and Russia to have 1,550 deployed strategic weapons, the Russians would only have to hold 5 targets at risk in the continental United States to entirely eliminate our nuclear inventory, with the exception of the boats are at sea at the time they were to do that. So Bangor, Washington, Kings Bay, Whiteman Air Force Base, Minot Air Force Base, Barksdale. And if you want to go after our storage, you shoot one more. And after they've done that, we've got what's left on the boats that are at sea, which in the future will be fewer than the boats we have at sea today because we're building fewer. And what if one day in that future, some guy in the Russian Navy wakes up and he says, "Comrade, I have some interesting news for you, Mr. Premier. We have a submarine in trail of one of the 2 U.S. nuclear submarines at sea. And they can do the math. They sink that boat, launch 5 missiles, and when it's all over, they have 1,545 weapons left, and we have what's left on one boat at sea." And the calculus would be, they'll probably surrender. Because if they don't, 1,445 weapons are coming against their cities. It invites a first attack. It's destabilizing. If you have 400 silos, they have to put at least 2 warheads on each silo. That's 800. Now it's a different calculus. And if you are smart, which we have been in the past and I hope we will continue to be in the future, and have those missiles on alert such that the president can launch them before the impact of the incoming rounds, they may have just wasted 800 rounds against empty silos, which mean it is a stable configuration. They will never wake up in the morning in that scenario and say, today's a good day to go. It's really important to have it. And the bomber is the most flexible, it's the most visible deterrent, it's the most assuring to all our allies. And its ability to upload cruise missiles in a short period of time is a great hedge against any technical failure that we might have in any of the other 2 legs, which might, wake up one day and say, hey, the Tridents, they don't work. And you've lost a third of your deterrent. And suddenly you can stand up quickly a cruise missile force of B-52s and future bombers that will keep the stable environment in place. So I'm a big supporter of the Triad. It's worked, and I don't see where dickering with it's going to matter. And those who would say it costs too much, do the math. Even the worst estimates I've seen is $360 billion. Spread over 15 to 20 years, so 3 to 5% of the DoD budget. It's not about cost, it's about priorities. It's about priorities. Sir.
Some of your top generals have mentioned something called the Thucydides principle, and this is regarding China. China is embarked on the One Road, One Belt, Silk Road, Maritime Silk Road. Their economy and their outreach to the world is growing exponentially in the physical sense. And the issue being posed is that the red line that we are seeking to deter them from. Do we, or let's say the power that is losing ground economically, financially, do they unleash the nuclear arsenal of the United States or threaten to unleash the nuclear arsenal of the United States as a way of preventing the ultimate economic development of not only China, but all the other nations with China, which will, and this is called, I think General Dempsey called it the Thucydides principle, where Athens went to war against Sparta. Before Sparta, they felt threatened economically. So this is the question: will the United States launch a preemptive nuclear war against this developing power, or will the United States work with that developing power and begin to work with that developing power? That's, I think, the fundamental issue.
I get the question. Yeah, no, I think
That's
the
the
latter.
question.
I think the latter is absolutely true. And there's nothing in our history to suggest that we would do the former. I mean, when Japan was kicking our butt economically 30 years ago, did we think, oh, maybe we ought to dust off the nukes and get them back in line? No, we rolled up our sleeves and competed. I've never heard any dialogue or discussion that would suggest that would ever be the utility or the purpose of the nuclear deterrent, ever.
Then we got to do something about our banking system because that's what's keeping us from competing. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Yes, sir.
I'm just going to jump in, and it's great to see so many questions lined up.
Yep.
For the purposes of those, in the back of the line, we're going to have to start getting out of here around 8:30 or 8:35. So
I'll answer quick. Just yes or no questions. I'm sorry. No, please. I talked too long. I'm sorry.
I have 2 short questions. Is peace and prosperity in our national interests?
Absolutely.
No, that they are our national interests
Yeah.
primarily, right?
Yeah.
And the second question is, does China have an inventory where they know in real time where every foreign satellite is located?
Do they have the ability to determine where they are?
In real time, they know exactly where everyone is.
Sure, they have a space surveillance network. They do. As do the Russians, as do a lot of people. I mean, there's hobbyists around the world who see things that we wish they wouldn't see. So yeah, that technology is out there. Yes, sir.
So this is in reference to cybersecurity and the difference between, spying and an attack.
Right.
Because I believe a lot of people in the intelligence community would consider the OPM breach an attack, is severely limiting to, the spying and strategic ability of the United States. So for you personally, what do you consider the difference between espionage and an attack?
Well, I think an attack either destroys something or, disables it. I mean, I think of it in physical terms, and I think you can cause physical effects in cyberspace. So you either disrupt, destroy, or degrade something with an attack. When you steal information, you're doing espionage. I mean, in the old days, to get that same stuff, someone would have had to cloak and dagger, sneak into the office in the middle of the night, crack the safe, get out his microfiche, take pictures, and send it back. That happened with the nuclear deterrent. I mean, Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, they gave those secrets away. That was espionage. Did we go to war over that? No. I can't think of an example in human history. There probably is one out there, but not in American history where we said, they spied on us, we're going to war. We don't do that, because guess what? We wouldn't want them to go to war against us when they caught our spies. Spying part is an acceptable, tacitly acceptable, if not formally acceptable, game to play. Attacks, it's a different thing. Pearl Harbor is different than that. Okay? Thanks. And you may say, it's just a lexicon thing. It's not important. I think words matter. And I think we are very undisciplined in our description of what's going on in cyberspace oftentimes. And I think we need to tighten that up a bit. That's just me. I'm not an English major, but please.
Thank you again for coming here. I saw a talk by Robert Rubin, former Treasury Secretary, that said the reason long-term capital management failed was the PhDs involved said nobody would ever let Russia collapse and let their ruble fall because they're a nuclear power and it would create proliferation of nuclear material into third world actors. Well, obviously they were wrong. So looking back on that now with 2020 hindsight, what could have been done differently to prevent what did happen?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's
it's a hard one.
More of an economic question that I'm certainly no expert at. But, collapse of a country that has nuclear weapons, collapse of the political system within that country. So look, when the Soviet Union fell apart, the world was lucky the way it fell apart. Yeah. There was violence there. There was, tanks shooting at the White House in Moscow. I had colleagues who were there on that day, working for NASA, and it was a scary time. But a lot worse things could have happened. And they didn't. I'll tell you what, the country that worries me the most in the world is Pakistan. And this is nothing against the Pakistan government. I'm not saying that. They're not an adversary. But if you can imagine that the number of Taliban that live in that country, if we had that percentage of the U.S. population were of that ilk, that were sworn adversaries to overthrow the government living amongst us in those large numbers, you darn well worry about the survival of the Pakistani government and their ability to control their nuclear weapons. So the collapse of any nuclear power should be a very big concern. And it's probably not the biggest concern to us. It's certainly a big concern to us. But India would certainly take notice.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, please.
So you just started to touch on what I was going to ask about, which is there's a set of actors in the Middle East, Taliban, ISIS, Al Qaeda, that let's call it classical deterrence in the ways you talked about tonight don't seem to play. Right. And I just wondered what you thought, what kind of deterrence you think, or how you would deal with that situation.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's a great debate. Can you deter a committed terrorist who's willing to blow himself up? Well, he certainly doesn't value.
Certainly willing to blow someone else up.
Yeah, but also themselves. Walk into a room and detonate. They certainly don't value life the same way we do, right? So you're not going to deter them with that. But they do have an end state in mind. They do have a vision for the world in mind of where they'd like it to go. And can you somehow convince them that the tactic of terrorism, which is really what we don't like, can we somehow convince them that that tactic is going to work against their ability to achieve that end state? That's denial of the benefit, right? That's what they want to achieve. They want to achieve a caliphate. And can you somehow, and I don't suggest that you can, but that's the kind of question that we have to ask ourselves before we first just immediately reject the notion that they can be deterred. It may be that they can't, and maybe the only answer is you just have to kill them all. But I'd prefer to, if it would be nice to put some thought into that and the possibility of how can you turn them away from using terrorism as their tool. Remember, if you look at Ireland, the history of Ireland and the use of terrorism there, and the use of terrorism in Israel by both sides in the early days, how did that turn away? When did the sides decide that that wasn't working in their best interest and that a political solution was a better answer? And I'm not really read in on the history of that or not, but I just pose that as something to look into, to say that the terrorism as a tactic might be discouraged, even with against someone who doesn't value their own life.
Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, Dave.
So, General, it's been suggested that nuclear deterrence may not be the best model to even begin to look at cyberspace, and perhaps how the world deters chemical or biological weapons may be a better model.
Yeah.
Would you care?
Yeah. Well, so let's. I'm not sure how well we do that. So, we used to have a part of our declaratory policy. It didn't used to say we have nuclear weapons to deter nuclear attack on the United States. We used to say we have them to deter weapons of mass destruction attack on the United States, which meant we held the nuclear sword over the head of anybody who would use chemical or biological weapons against us, because we define those in certain circumstances to be weapons of mass destruction. Now, that may be a bit of a stretch for chemical. It depends on how you define mass, okay? But I'll tell you, I'm frightened by the prospects of the research and technology going on in the biological area today, and the prospects of that not so much getting in the hands of a nation state, but in the hands of a terrorist or an individual actor. So we did use nuclear weapons to deter, and we certainly did in the Gulf War. Look at Dick Cheney went over there as the Secretary of Defense and looked across the border and made a declaratory statement. Now, he didn't say we'll use nukes, but he said we will be not constrained in our response if you use chemical weapons in the fight that's coming. And the only way you can stop this fight is to get out of Kuwait. And we know, reading post-war, post-Iraqi freedom in 2003, we got documents and talked to people, it worked. They got the message that they did not use chemical weapons because they feared a nuclear response from the United States. We weren't going to come back chemical. We were going to come back nuclear. The other thing I'd say is, so did you ever read the book Biohazard by Ken Albeck? So, 1972, the United States rejects biological warfare. The Soviets say, we do too. And the very next year, they spend 1 billion rubles developing biological weapons. Okay, they just accelerate their program for the next 10 years. And they come clean in the 90s at the end of the Cold War. So, I think it can be deterred with that because, again, what do they value? Power, maintaining control. I think chemical and nuclear can be deterred, or chemical and biological can be deterred with nuclear. And so I'm not sure of the model that works absent that threat, other than a treaty kind of model. And we know people cheat on treaties, unverifiable treaties. They cheat. They may try to cheat on the verifiable ones too, but we'll likely catch them. Does that answer your question, Dave?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm asking you this question on so you're a general and you have a lot of knowledge in the military. And,
that's a big assumption.
Yeah, and so you can totally say yes or no. My feelings won't be hurt if you don't want to answer this question. So I've seen a lot of movies, and I'm a young mind, and I've been told to think outside the box. And so, I think America's biggest fear is terrorism, and yet I don't think that we've ever gone to war due to a natural disaster or any country. And so what kind of deterrence is there, possibly in the future for the United States to have an offensive kind of terrorist kind of infiltrate Russia, put people in there, and then maybe like a Flint River crisis or burning down forests, all of a sudden random fires taking down, and then we'd say, hey, we have a threat, we have infiltrated, we have people, you have no idea who they are, we have Homeland Security, they don't have possibly that kind of a... Well,
you're suggesting that we would have that capability and execute against them to impose our will on them.
Yeah.
Well, it would be attributable, right?
I think it'd be a good deterrence.
No, they would. I would suspect that they would respond to that. It's an attack, and they could attribute it to us. I wouldn't cross that threshold because the penalty could be nuclear response. I don't know how they're going to respond to that in your scenario. So it's. I don't see that as a worthwhile strategy to develop to coerce or compel somebody.
I'm just thinking as far as what matters to them. So maybe
you could do that. But could you say, if you do this, then we're going to do that? That may not be credible.
All right.
And if you cross the line and demonstrate it, you may have crossed a red line that you didn't want to cross. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
We really only have 5 more minutes, so I'm not sure.
Okay, we can get through these 9, no problem. 8, 7, we're fast. Okay.
Thanks for a really thought-provoking lecture. So my question was sort of talking about red lines and sort of deterrence strategy in general. The Atlantic had a really nice piece about the Obama doctrine, looking at the red line in Syria. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on how that whole situation played out. Did it really sort of affect our credibility, or did sort of working diplomatic channels with Russia to go in there and do that stuff? Did that work out in the end? Like how?
I thought it weakened the United States internationally, and Russia came out as the good guys, and we came out as the weak player on this playground that drew the line in the sand, and they crossed it, and we stepped back and drew another line. And Russia got to come in and look like the hero. And that weakened our political status in the world. That's my personal opinion. Okay.
Yes, sir. I wanted to push back a little bit. You mentioned that there's no way to defend satellites because they're sort of made of balsa wood.
That was a little hyperbole there.
Right.
You grant me that.
Well, I wanted to make sort of a devil's advocate question and see how you would shoot this down.
Yeah.
We live now in a day where any amateur radio enthusiast can, for $1,000, launch a CubeSat, which is about a 10-inch, I believe, cube satellite that has very little capability, but it is able to relay an HF radio signal. So I'm wondering, what's to stop the United States from, say, spending $1 billion and launching 1 million of these CubeSats and just having 1 million sort of balsa wood satellites
that's another strategy that's been proposed. I agree. So overwhelm them. But as a fighter pilot, I'm always reminded that Baron von Richthofen, who was the leading ace in World War I, most of his kills were against unarmed reconnaissance aircraft. It's called a target-rich environment. You love to enter that. You just get to be an ace quicker when you got more targets to shoot at. However, if they're really cheap and inexpensive and effective targets, you may shift the cost-imposing equation. In other words, it's going to be today. It's cheaper to shoot down a satellite than it is to launch one of these, to build and launch one of these effective, highly effective satellites. And so we're on the wrong side of the cost-imposing equation. We want to build a lot of big, expensive satellites. But if you can make the ASAT more expensive than the satellites that you have up there, then you win the economic battle, which kind of happened in the Cold War, frankly. One of the greatest shifts in the cost-imposing equation, which, by the way, missile defense, we're on the wrong side of the cost-imposing equation there. It's far cheaper to build an intercontinental ballistic missile with a warhead on it than it is to try to shoot one down, put the system in place, shoot it down. But we're willing to pay that cost because of the uncertainty with North Korea. But the advent of the cruise missile was a huge cost imposition upon the Soviet Union, who had spent countless amount of money to develop radar warning systems and surface-to-air missile batteries and air defense airplanes on alert all over their country with a tremendous landmass to protect, because they feared the penetrating U.S. bomber. And then we invent the cruise missile, and the bomber stands outside the range of all those assets and launches 20 independently targeted cruise missiles that cannot be detected by their radars. All that money was wasted. That's cost imposition, which is another reason why I'm a big proponent of cruise missiles. They're very cost imposing.
I'm afraid this last question, unfortunately.
Okay, and I will, as we go out, I'll answer the other questions that are queued up. I'm not running off, so please.
Okay. I'm wondering, it seems today that starting a war would be economically extremely expensive. Do you think it's actually necessary to deter war, given that if China would actually shoot down a satellite, they could expect their market to crash, at least to some extent?
People said that in 1914, the exact same thing. They did. There's writings about it. They said, there's no way we'll have a global war or a war on the continent of Europe because there's too much to lose economically for all the interested parties. And yet we did. And it wasn't a little war. It's an awful war. And we couldn't stop ourselves once it got started. Although I'm very hopeful about the future, I'm an optimist in some regards, I am pessimistic about the human condition. And I don't believe the last Osama bin Laden's been born. I don't believe the last Kim Jong-un has been born. I don't believe the last Adolf Hitler has been born. And so illogical things can happen. And you have to be able to deter illogical things from happening if you want to sleep more securely at night. That would be my answer.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Enjoyed it. Yeah, cool. And if you didn't get if you had a question, I'll just hang around right up here. Come on up.